Confabulation with me, Jay Mills. Now today I have the pleasure of speaking with a beauty who has a heart for implementing changes in various departments within the government industry. She is the former regional administrator of the U.S. General Services Administration, Northeast and Caribbean region, and she is the former New York State Deputy Superintendent of Banks. She is also the former New York City Assistant Comptroller of Commercial Banking. I would like to welcome Miss Denise Pease.
Thank you so very much. It's an honor to be
to be
interviewed by you.
I can't wait to talk to you. How are you?
I am blessed.
That's
blessed.
Good. Great answer.
Blessed.
How did you get the opportunity to be appointed by former President Barack Obama to serve as regional administrator for the U.S. GSA?
Well, I think it's because friends supported me, and I think that was what the Lord had in store for me.
Nice.
My background was that I had tackled several interesting projects for the government in the state and the local, and they wanted someone who was a strategic thinker and who could change the culture of GSA. And because I'm a woman with a disability also, they thought it would be a good match because as we were looking at where federal buildings would be, to make sure that they're accessible to everyone.
Nice. And what were some of your responsibilities in that position?
I was responsible for the real estate.
Okay.
GSA is the largest real estate holder in the world. So I was in charge of all of the federal buildings in New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands.
Okay.
And it's not just the construction of federal buildings, it's also the maintenance of federal buildings. When you look at a federal courthouse or the leases where federal agencies lease from the private sector, and also the procurement of goods and services for the federal government comes from the General Services Administration. And something that I am not as fluent in, but I'm interested in is the technology. GSA is also the technology arm of the federal government. They do a lot with the technology and making sure that federal websites, federal technology is accessible to everyone.
Nice. And did you have the opportunity to get into the technology aspect of it?
Not as much as I should have. Sometimes what happens when you're very senior, it's easy to get someone to do that kind of thing for you. So I think that now that I'm on staycation, that's something I need to, because technology is really the wave of the future. Everything we do now has a technology basis.
Yep, it's happening super fast.
It's super fast. When I first started learning computers, which was more than now 40 years ago, the computer could fit into my whole living room and dining room and wasn't as powerful as my iPhone.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
It's like Hidden Figures type thing.
Yes. And I'm almost that age.
So can you share some of your most successful projects that you were involved in?
Well, I think throughout my career, some of my successful projects, I would have to say, is looking at where there was a need and where the government could be more accessible to everyone.
Okay.
So that when you start to talk about the foreclosure crisis that hit, I was a person with a disability, and I couldn't read and write in the late 1990s. And as a former deputy superintendent of banking, I was given a mortgage that was a predatory loan. So that when I came back to work in the office of the city controller, I kept telling him, this is a wave that people are going to be affected. I had told him about 1 million New Yorkers would be affected by the mortgage crisis. Mm-hmm. And he said, oh no, Denise, you're exaggerating. But more than 2 million people were affected when it actually happened. But what I was able to do was to put in an anti-foreclosure program at the controller's office. As well as I noticed that where the mortgage brokers were most active was in neighborhoods that didn't have a bank branch. Okay. So as the banking person for the controller, I implemented a program with a lot of really creative colleagues so that we could direct the city's deposits to encourage bank branches in those neighborhoods that would be most affected by the foreclosure crisis. And that's kind of stabilized the market.
Okay.
When I was at GSA, I had everything from I had Puerto Rico and I had New York. So, the state I was on the president's task force for Puerto Rico. So we were trying to do things in Puerto Rico before the hurricane hit. And
Okay.
so, but we were trying to make the federal buildings more accessible and looking at how we could create more opportunities for businesses in Puerto Rico. So as we built, one of the last things I was able to do was to look at what a need was for the federal government, which would have been a new FBI building, but also expanding the reach for small businesses in Puerto Rico to become actively involved in that building to create an opportunity for jobs. The
Nice.
other thing I'm proud of is I moved the federal government back into the World Trade Center site. That was something that I knew that I had to do. That was my primary responsibility to make sure that people knew that we were not defeated, and also
Right.
it gave us an opportunity to look at how the federal government would look in the 21st century. So that's really a 21st century type of workplace. And then I was on the Access Board for GSA. I was GSA's representative on the Access Board. And on the Access Board, looking at ways that the federal government is accessible to everyone, particularly people with disabilities.
Okay. Wow. So basically, what you do and the projects that you do are always in mind of giving back to people
Yes.
and helping them with getting opportunities and such like that.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Now, what were some challenges, being an African American woman and just a woman in general and being in that position?
Well, I think that there were always obstacles. I mean, but one of the things about being in government I was aware of is to, particularly in a very senior position, is to create an opportunity for someone who's not in government.
Okay.
So, for example, when I was deputy superintendent of banks, there was a bank at that point in time called, I think, Manufacturers Hanover Trust. And they fired a woman, an African-American woman, because she had braids. So it was a state-chartered bank.
Okay.
And I had the opportunity to go to their board of directors meetings. So what I did was I put braids in my hair. Because as their regulator, if I could do my job with braids, that meant that anybody who worked for the bank could work for them.
Right.
By the same token, after I'm a person with epilepsy.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have now a leg disability where my legs don't move as well. And there was always the stigma attached to being a woman, but there was really a stigma attached to being a person with epilepsy. Okay. So I think that one of the things I've done in my career is also made people aware of people with disabilities, that we do have something to contribute. Right. That we have to make facilities, accommodations for people with disabilities. But also, as an African American woman, I was the first African American to be the regional administrator in this region, which is hard to believe with the diversity that we have in this region. I was the first person of color. And I think that you bring something to jobs like that so that people understand and they get used to having their leadership, particularly being a woman and a woman of color, and what we can contribute to the society.
Right. So before you were working with Obama, you were a comptroller of commercial banking. Can you explain what that position entails?
Well, when you say working with Obama, there were 1,300 of us who had presidential appointments.
Yeah.
So I mean, I wasn't working with him every day, but I did get a chance to meet him several times, and working with him was probably the greatest honor of my life. Mm-hmm. When I met him for my official picture with him, he had heard about me because we had, and I know this is not an answer to your question, but I just wanted to state it at this time. He wanted to meet me because he had heard I was a person with a disability.
Okay.
And I was responsible for getting the federal government back up and running after Superstorm Sandy.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I went in to meet him, I was in the diplomatic room and I had a tear in my eye. And he said, "No, I've heard about you. You're a hard nut." He said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, it's the miracle of God that my great-grandmother was born a slave. And here I am working for the first African-American president. So I mean, I am just over. These are tears of joy, and
Right.
These are tears of history. Now, what did the commercial banking entail? I was working for an African-American man who's the controller of the city of New York, Bill Thompson.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned, Bill allowed me to create a division for commercial banking and to do some of the things with the foreclosure. Where does the city place its money? How do we make sure that positions are opened for people in the banking industry? Mm-hmm. Are there people of color on some of the boards of some of the banks that control? So that was a very interesting position.
Okay. And can you just share how you got started into that?
Well, I got started into that. I went to the banking department as an urban analyst and rose through the ranks and became a deputy superintendent of banking. And so as a deputy superintendent of banking, I was responsible for the consumer area of the banking department. Right. So that there's state chartered banks and then there are federally chartered banks. And so the state chartered banks at that point in time were some of the largest banks in New York. So, the Community Reinvestment Act, putting more teeth into that to prevent redlining, to make sure people had access to credit, also to other banking services through the consumer division, and to make sure that some of the compliance issues were addressed for banks because as they would merge, they had to come through me, and so that was an opportunity to get more for people.
Okay, nice. And you've had so many positions in the government industry. What would you say is what would you say was your favorite job, and what was your least favorite job? If you can be honest.
I'm going to say, now that I'm older, I can find benefits even in my least favorite.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I can find benefits in my least favorite. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to tell you which it was. Because I don't know who's watching this blog. But I think that my most favorite was the last job working for the president. Nice. I can say that the banking department was also a great job.
Okay.
And I can say that the controller's office allowed me to get back to work after being a person with a disability and being out of work for a while. Okay. So those are my three major jobs. So I really can't say which one was better because each one benefited me greatly.
That's good. That's good. Now, for any beauties who want to work in the government industry, how can they get started? Do they need to know someone who works in the government industry? Do they need to get an internship? How does that happen?
I think a little bit of both. Okay. It depends on at what stage the beauty is. Okay. Okay. If it's like someone like you who's in high school, mm-hmm. My goddaughter, I got her started very early. She used to sometimes chagrin at doing political things, like doing the mailing when there was a political campaign, getting to know some of the candidates. It taught her about government. Her mother, we would take her to functions, and so she would meet people. So, there are a lot of things you can do. You can volunteer in a government office sometimes. Now that, after 9/11, that changed a little bit because now many government offices have so much security involved that sometimes it's harder for a young person. But on the political side, there's not that much, there are not that many problems because sometimes it's a short period of time or you're in somebody's elective office. There's also something to be said for the civil service system while we have it. Going in at a lower level, raising yourself up. I always say government is good even for people who want to be in the private sector because you get a chance to meet people sometimes that are in the private sector who could help you in your advancement. Okay. Because you get to meet people that I met at the level I met, for example, when I was deputy superintendent of banks. My counterpart in the private sector, when I say my counterpart coming out of school, when I came out of school, my age level, may not have been able to meet people at that level.
Okay, so basically networking is like the major key to get into the industry. Yes. Okay, so make sure, beauties, that you are networking with some people who work in the government industry. Find your way in. You're a breast cancer survivor and you also have epilepsy, which you mentioned a couple times in this interview. Can you tell the beauties what epilepsy is, and if you're comfortable, can you just share how you got it?
Okay. Epilepsy is a disease that deals with the neurology of your brain. Okay. It also tells you your brain misfires. Unfortunately, epilepsy is one of the diseases that has a stigma attached to it. People have told me that I had demonic possession. So a lot of people go without treatment because people are afraid to get treatment with epilepsy, and they're afraid to acknowledge it. Epilepsy, I developed epilepsy from a car accident. I have epilepsy affected my temporal lobe of my brain, both sides of my brain, temporal lobes. My brain, they said, rattled in the car against my skull, probably. And so that's how I developed epilepsy. But there's so many new treatments for epilepsy that people have to be aware of to be able to control it. The thing with medical marijuana with children with epilepsy has been very effective. Also, different drugs. Now epilepsy, the drug I take for epilepsy now is now one of the older drugs. When it was one of the newer drugs, it's a Neurontin. But there are so many. Someone asked me if I was taking phenobarbital. I can't take phenobarbital. That, for my type of epilepsy, that's bad. But that was the generic drug 10, 15 years ago. But now there's so many different drugs. And there's even a specialty with a neurologist called an epileptologist. And I would tell a beauty whose epilepsy is not controlled to try to find an epileptologist. If you're in a major metropolitan area, there are probably epileptologists, but since we're online, there are epileptologists that your neurologist can contact for better treatment, because the important thing is to get the seizures under control.
Right. And after your accident, how did you find the strength to get back into your career and to also give back?
Well, I think it came from God first, the Lord. But I also have to give props to my goddaughter, Monica, because Monica came to live with me at a time when I thought I was doing something for her. Okay. And what the Lord was teaching me, she was doing something for me. Because when she graduated from college, I have to be very thankful. And people say I spoil Monica, but I don't really spoil her. She's the great woman, and she came to live with me when they had told my family that they were going to put me in an institution. And she believed that I could get better. And she stayed with me, went through some of the hard times of seizure activity, and helped make me, with the help of the Lord and medication, the woman I am now.
Wow, nice. And it was also you, too. You had to find the strength to get better as well.
Yeah.
you were also the secretary of the board of directors of the Epilepsy Foundation of America and the chairperson of AfricanAmerican Initiative. So, what were some changes that you implemented to help those with disabilities?
Well, one of the changes that I implemented was to make sure that people who were advocates for disabilities were on the epilepsy board.
Okay.
And so that I think it was very important, particularly when we were doing the reauthorization of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I say that my brother and my mentor in the epilepsy movement is former Congressman Tony Coelho.
Okay.
He was also on the board of the Epilepsy Foundation. And also to make sure that the advocacy and people with disabilities, particularly African Americans, as I said, would take some of the stigma away from having epilepsy, to be able to know what's available and also to speak your challenge. You know, sometimes just saying I have epilepsy and I need certain things, people were becoming very inward about it.
Okay.
So it was also to bring some of the myths about epilepsy to the surface. And I always think about, when I think about epilepsy, I always think about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman had a brain injury.
Oh.
She had epilepsy. Well, they didn't know it was epilepsy then. They called it auras.
Okay.
But she used to have auras. And she went back over 19 times and rescued slaves.
Yep.
With the epilepsy. So every time I have a Denise pity party day,
you think about Harriet Tubman. Nice. So you do so much to give back, including that foundation. And is there anything else that you're in the works of completing or that you're doing right now?
I think that I want to go back to government a little bit. Not the federal government right now. Not right now. We're not going to say why, but not right now. But I do want to get back, and I think I want to get back more to make government more accessible to everyone, whether you have a disability or you're able-bodied, or whether you're a person of color or you're Caucasian, or government has to be the place that responds to everyone's needs.
Right.
And to make sure that there's a future for people like you know, our young leaders. And so I really think that I want to do one more stint in government, I think.
Nice. And you will.
Yes, thank you.
Now, do you have any last advice for the beauties?
I think the last advice is the world is your oyster. You know, it's filled with endless possibilities. You have to believe in yourself, but believe in a God, because you have to know that there's a higher power than you. That really will govern whatever you're going to do. And don't give up. Ask a lot of questions. When someone tells you no, find out why it's a no and why it can't be a yes. But you have the world that's opening up. As I said, in 3 generations, my family went from slavery to being an appointee for an African-American president. I hope that one of you or one of your beauties will be, I'll be sitting in the audience when you take an oath of office on the South Portico, or you could change it to the North Portico of the Capitol, and you become, and they call you Madam President.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for chatting with me. I feel like I've learned so much.
Oh, well, I've learned a lot about you because you're a great lady.
Thank you so much. But before you go, I do have a gift for you.
Oh, thank you.
You can open it.
Oh, happy days. Oh, I love this. You know, I like little bags like this. I collect them.
Really?
Yes, I love them. I love them. I love them. I love them.
It's a Girls with Beauty and Brain shirt.
You know, I am being inducted into the Links.
Yes, congrats.
Yes, thank you. And we had a Project Embrace to combat bullying, and the shirt was the same color.
Really?
Oh, yes. So I'm getting stylish. I'm becoming stylish.
Remember, beauties, that Miss Denise is a Girls with Beauty and Brains, and so are you. Thank you. Bye.